So sure, it's a massive invasion of our personal privacy. It's more extensive than anything any of us have imagined this side of a science fiction movie before now.
The United States and other imperialist powers look to seize that opening and manipulate it for their own interests.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to The Struggle. The Struggle is shown on 22 cable stations from Vermont to New York City, on the internet at thestruggle.org, our YouTube channel, Struggle Video Media. At the end of June, scores of people met in Berlin, Connecticut to think of ways to protect our rapidly dwindling right to privacy. Attorney Peter Goselin talked about how often the charge of espionage is used not against foreign spies, but against whistleblowers and the left.
I was asked if I could put some of the information that we have been talking about the NSA spying scandal and about Edward Snowden and about the lawsuits that are going on into some sort of a context. And so I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about the problem, and I was thinking, I know the folks who put together the flyer for this program basically were sort of posing the question, is this really just like Facebook collecting like all of your information? And I was thinking about how we have come to think about this problem of privacy, I think especially activists. And the funny thing is, I sort of ended up with this quote by Che Guevara, the Latin American revolutionary, who said, "If you tremble with indignation at every injustice, then you are a comrade of mine." And, you know, I was thinking that I think all of us, everybody in this room, understands this on a very personal level, what Che meant. After all, what is it that makes us activists, unless it's a sense of urgency, provoked by a feeling that something is very wrong and needs to be righted? And who has not trembled with indignation at injustice, whether it touches ourselves or our families, our communities, the nation we live in, or the world? But here's the problem. Trembling with indignation is tiring business. It has a tendency to wear you out, especially when you're feeling outraged at injustice that's either ignored or trivialized or simply lied about in the media every day. So over weeks or months or years, it's difficult not to allow that sense of indignation to harden into cynicism. And I think that's why, for example, so many activists describe Jon Stewart's The Daily Show, for whatever political faults it may have, as more like the news than the news. Because its take on the day's events are laced with this kind of dark humor and sarcasm that sometimes feels like a little bit of an antidote to the feeling of being helplessly outraged and angry, that the feeling that you get every day from watching, say, CNN lie to you outright about something. Now, on June 5th, it was revealed that the National Security Administration had been obtaining these incredibly broad warrants from the Federal Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. These warrants give the NSA license to collect data relating to millions of electronic mail, telephone, and other electronic communications from all of the, seemingly from all of the major communications companies, not just Verizon. And initially, we understood that what was being collected was merely, and I put merely in quotes here, merely metadata, what one might describe as the who, where, when, and how of a telephone call or an email, without the content of the communication. But more recent revelations seem to indicate that sometimes the what, the content of the communication, is also being inspected and possibly preserved. Now, I think if we take a look across the spectrum of the responses that we have heard to these revelations, from political activists, civil libertarians, people who are concerned about government spying and government intrusion into our personal lives, we're seeing two very dangerous responses to these revelations. First, there are the folks who, as I said, are feeling a little worn out and maybe a little bit defeated. They don't like the idea of government spying, but they have become cynical about it. And one of the ways this is being expressed is by the sentiment that this news about the NSA spying on millions of Americans, collecting our email, collecting our telephone conversations, maybe collecting not only the where and the when and the how, but also the what of those communications, that this is not a really big deal, right? Because after all, everybody knows the government spies on us. Everyone knows, or ought to know by now, and certainly if you're sitting in this room, you ought to know by now, that electronic communications aren't really private. They're nowhere near as private as we like to think. Sandy was talking about the concept of privacy as a reasonable expectation. And to a large extent, one thing that the courts have very consistently held in recent years is that one cannot have a reasonable expectation of privacy in a cell phone conversation or in an email transaction, because these are mediums that really are not, generally not secure. So, first of all, there is this sense of, okay, they've been doing this for years, what's the big deal now? Why should we care about this? And second, the second perspective that we've heard, and I think this is it's scary and it's also kind of sad given who it's coming from, is that there are some progressive-minded folks who are basically embracing and even parroting the Obama administration's talking points. And I should say not just the Obama administration, but the entire Democratic Party administration, the entire Democratic Party machinery, that after all, the spying isn't really spying. Or maybe it is spying, but it's not really illegal. Or maybe it's really illegal, but it's not that bad. Or maybe it's bad, but it won't really have that much of an effect on anyone. And this is the really scary part. If you've heard this said, you've heard this said by maybe friends of yours, people who you consider allies in the struggle. Maybe it's not that bad, because after all, what do you have to worry about if you haven't done something wrong? What's the big deal? Well, what is the big deal exactly? Now, does it really only boil down to this? That the United States government is in the process of building, in fact, they're about to open, the world's largest data storage center in Bluffdale, Utah. People know about this, right? One NSA official simply called the Utah facility just a big file cabinet out in the western area. And if you take a look at the government documents that relate to the building of this facility, they make a big point of saying, this facility is not engaged in spying. Well, sure. That's like saying that, if you wiretapped someone and you kept recordings on a flash drive, that flash drive wasn't spying. It's just a data storage unit. That's all it is. And that's what this facility in Utah, so technically speaking, yeah, it's not spying. It's collecting the fruits of spying. It's collecting the fruits of spying on a scale that nobody has even been able to imagine prior to this. I read yesterday when I was doing a little bit of research on this that this new facility is going to preserve up to something called a yottabyte of data. And I love this. It's like, a yottabyte, I haven't even heard of this before. They have described it as the equivalent of 500 quintillion pages of text. And there are folks here that understand this sort of thing better than me, but I understand that this is the largest data storage term that is currently in use. In other words, those of us who grew up becoming familiar, like starting to become familiar with computers and hearing about kilobytes and megabytes and then gigabytes, a yottabyte is as big as it gets. So apparently, when they open this facility, it will give them the ability to store not just your telephone and email communications, which is a pretty big deal, but also records of your online purchases, records of the books you checked out of your local library, and the parking tickets that you paid online. And they will be able to preserve this, theoretically, forever. So sure, it's a massive invasion of our personal privacy. It's more extensive than anything any of us have imagined this side of a science fiction movie before now. But how is it different? And I think maybe this goes to a question that was posed earlier. How is it different from Google collecting information about the websites that I visit? How is it different from Facebook using algorithms to determine which advertisements they're going to display to me when I log on? Which, after all, is a project that seems to be pretty much in its infancy, judging by the number of times that these ads have either invited me to visit Israel, have asked whether I favor deporting illegal aliens, or have asked me to purchase American flag baseball caps. So, I'm not really sure. If that were the extent of it, I'm not sure I'd really be all that worried. Certainly one thing we want to consider is how the US government is treating the revelations about this spying. After all, it took the federal government less than 2 weeks to seek an indictment against Edward Snowden who's the person who blew the whistle on this, to charge him with espionage and theft of government documents. Espionage, seriously? I think it's helpful when we're thinking about the implications of this, of what the government thinks are the implications of its data collection process. Is it really just like Facebook? Is it really just like Google? Is to take a look at this. Well, when have the feds relied on the Espionage Act before? Now, this law, first of all, part of the answer is simply in the formal name of the law. It's the Espionage Act of 1917. And it was passed right around the time that the U.S. entered World War I. And it was passed, first of all, in order to enable the federal government to prosecute members of the Radical Labor Union, the Industrial Workers of the World, and the Socialist Party of America. It was the law that a year later amended under the name of the Sedition Act that sent Eugene Victor Debs, probably one of the most prominent socialist leaders of his time, to jail for a sentence of 10 years for giving a speech, the famous Canton speech, in which he advocated resistance to the draft or to recruiting for the military. Obstructing recruiting was actually the formal charge, but it was a felony charge under the Sedition Act, which was, as I said, was an amendment to the Espionage Act, and resulted in a 10-year sentence, which ended up, as a lot of folks know, was commuted after 5 years. So 1918, 1919, the Espionage Act is being used again in the so-called Palmer raids to send thousands of political activists, left-wing political activists and labor union leaders who were not U.S. citizens, to have them deported from the United States and sent to the Soviet Union. That included the prominent anarchist Emma Goldman. Fast forward to the 1950s, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were charged under the Espionage Act of 1917. And in fact, this month marks the 60th year anniversary since their execution. 1971, Daniel Ellsberg and Anthony Russo were charged with felonies under the Espionage Act for publishing the Pentagon Papers that blew the whistle on the government's lies to the American people about the Vietnam War. Some folks may remember that in the 1990s, the United States government used the Espionage Act to bring charges against a scientist at the Los Alamos National Laboratory named Dr. Wen-Ho Lee. And Dr. Lee was supposed to have disclosed government documents, classified government documents, to the Chinese government. The case against Dr. Lee was accompanied by an overtly racist anti-China campaign in the popular media, and it was so incredibly flimsy. This case that was brought under the Espionage Act was so incredibly flimsy that after he actually won a lawsuit, a civil lawsuit, against the government for $1 million for damages, the judge who initially took the plea deal against him under the Espionage Act apologized to him for having believed the patent lies that the government had told about him. And of course, the most recent addition to the pantheon of people who have been charged under the Espionage Act is Bradley Manning, who's accused of providing military documents to WikiLeaks, allegedly for the purpose of harming the United States government. So Edward Snowden, you might say, is in good company, but the company that he keeps strongly suggests that the government doesn't view his whistleblowing as only about an invasion of our privacy, that there's something that's more important going on here. And when you think about what that might be, the answer is really incredibly simple. It's a truism that we have used since the development of the first atomic bomb, that there is no weapon that can be built that won't also be used. And if information is power, then the technology that gives the government the ability to collect information is also potentially a weapon. Now, how has domestic information gathering been used as a weapon? Or maybe we should ask, how has it not been used as a weapon? The FBI acknowledges that over the last several years, there's been a meteoric rise in hate crimes against Muslims and also against Latinos. Have we seen this accompanied by a meteoric rise in the use of government technology to prosecute these hate crimes? Absolutely not. What about the use of terror tactics against women's health clinics? We've seen those on the rise. Have we seen evidence that the government is using this incredible wealth of data and all of this technology in order to bust these anti-women hate groups? Clearly not. To the contrary, what we've seen is a dramatic escalation in the use of high technology surveillance to spy on, interfere with, disrupt, and arrest community activists in the Muslim community, environmental activists, people in solidarity with Palestine, and in broad terms, the Occupy movement. Now, some of us who are old enough to remember COINTELPRO, the government spying program that especially targeted the Black Liberation Movement and the student anti-war movement in the 60s and 70s, recognize this. What we're looking at now is COINTELPRO on steroids, on high-tech steroids. We have seen in the last few years the emergence of something called fusion centers. The fusion centers are a network of 77 primary intelligence gathering centers. They're actually hosted not by the federal government, by local authorities or state authorities within the areas in which they are located. And the Department of Homeland Security describes them as the focal point within the state and local environment for the receipt, analysis, gathering, and sharing of threat-related information. In other words, exactly the kind of information that can be obtained through collecting all of this information about each one of us, about our activities, about who we talk to, and when and where and how we talk to them, and what we have to say to them. In other words, the NSA collects the data and stores it, and fusion centers and other parts of the government police apparatus use that data in order to address what they have designated as threats. And as we know, the determination of threats has recently included all manner of perfectly legal activity, from religious observance to charitable works to political expression. Now, I think when you take this issue of surveillance and data gathering and put it into the context of police powers that are being used to spy on and disrupt people and organizations, that really ought to be enough to answer the so what question. The so what question that's posed by cynics and by Obama apologists. So what? What difference does it make if we're doing this? Well, this is the difference that it makes. And that might be enough. I would think it would be enough. But I'm going to tell you that I think there is actually an even graver concern that we should have. And, you know, folks who know me know that I don't like to peddle conspiracy theories. I believe that conspiracy theories sow distrust. I think they disempower people, and I think they distract people from the way that the system actually really does work. So, you know, consider my words in that context. But I think that what we're witnessing here is such an exponential expansion of government surveillance, combined with a similar exponential expansion of law enforcement efforts directed against peaceable activities. This is like COINTELPRO, and the differences are in scope, but not in character. But I think that there is one other difference which we're seeing. And actually, I think that Sandy alluded to this, and I don't know that this is necessarily what she meant, but it's certainly what I drew from it. That, you know, what we're looking at here is a system of government surveillance that in the past was used behind closed doors, without any sort of government surveillance, and with the idea that, you know, when it came to light, Congress might very well place some check on it, or the judicial system might place some kind of check on it. But what we're witnessing every day as these revelations come out is that the political body seems to have no interest whatsoever in placing any check, or even in understanding the full scope of these revelations. So on the one hand, we've got the right-wing populist politicians who are ranting about big government, but they're not interested in this form of big government. On the other hand, we've got the liberal constitutionalist politicians who are saying, we have to protect the Bill of Rights, but are completely silent about one of the gravest threats to our Bill of Rights. And I think that what we're actually seeing right here is the foundation for the development of, in a very genuine sense, a security state. A security state in which the government's spying and the government's police activities are so thoroughly insulated from any political repercussions, and perhaps eventually from any judicial repercussions, such that we are now looking at the point when a legislative response or a judicial response might really be quite meaningless, where these so-called checks and balances that exist within this system become no more than a useless appendage, and the operations of organizations like the NSA and the FBI and the CIA become the government, become the only appeal to their good nature is the only recourse with which we're left. So I think in response to the question, so what? I think these revelations present us with something that is so incredibly dangerous that it's not an exaggeration to say that it genuinely threatens the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and any semblance of democracy that's left in this society.
There are many different views about Assad in Syria, but the left is united in demanding the U.S. government keep its nose out and stop sending in weapons. UNAC answered, and UFPJ called for demonstrations in early July. At the protest in New Haven, we interviewed Chris Garaffa and Chris Gavreau, who had quite different views about the conflict. Could you explain the reason for the protest?
Sure. We're out here today in New Haven to oppose the upcoming U.S., NATO, and Israeli intervention in Syria. We've seen that the U.S. government and its partners in NATO and Israel have been ramping up their war rhetoric against the Syrian government, which is defending the sovereignty of its country in the past couple of years. And we're here to say that, you know, the future of Syria is for Syrians to decide, and we oppose any sort of foreign intervention in Syria.
And the Israelis have bombed Syria a couple of times recently.
Yes, they have. There was a terrible bombing, I believe, in May in Damascus, killed a number of people, and the Israeli government has not had to answer for that yet.
What do you think of other countries being involved, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Russia, etc.?
Well, in the case of Qatar and Saudi Arabia, we see they're U.S. client states, they're U.S. partners in the region. They have an interest in what's happening in the region. Russia also has an interest, but it's not a U.S. client. It's trying to protect itself, the encroachment of NATO to its borders. And Russia is acting in an anti-imperialist stance, whereas Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and others are acting in a pro-imperialist, pro-United States intervention stance. Thank you, Stan.
Well, I'm one of those people who, for several years, has been feeling a tremendous amount of solidarity with the working people and farmers in Syria who rose up against the Assad dictatorship. Unfortunately, as you know, every time there's instability or some kind of opening in this oil-rich and politically important region, the United States and other imperialist powers look to seize that opening and manipulate it for their own interests. And I think, unfortunately, that's what's happened in Syria. The farmers and working people who built a large democratic movement to oppose Assad have basically been sidelined, and they've been restricted, unfortunately, to village defense committees and small city councils, but have not been allowed to exert their political will over the military struggle that has unfolded there. This is terrible because it means that the military struggle there is in the hands of the elite, just other business elites, fundamentalist forces that are not aligned, don't share the democratic political perspectives of the original rank-and-file grassroots opposition in Syria. And I hope for these grassroots groups, you know, to be able to mature to the place where they can offer a real democratic alternative to the Assad regime. And I think that U.S. intervention is a major, you know, is likely to be maybe even the major obstacle to that happening.
It's basically ruined the revolt, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think it has ruined the revolt. I mean, I have hope for the future. I mean, people still have the aspirations to have a democratic, secular, and just social order in Syria. But for the moment, the U.S. has contributed hugely to the fact that the revolt against Assad is now really in the hands of Islamist reactionary Islamist forces funded by Qatar, Saudi Arabia, U.S. arms that are coming through Libyan militias, and elite businessmen who have the money to organize militias. And so the grassroots movement has been sidelined, and the battle we have going on there, is basically one that's going to set a terrible example, where if the opposition wins at this point, what it'll do is establish one more time the right of imperialism to intervene against a sovereign nation, and do it to cut off the head of the democratic rank and file movement, and in its place put organizations in the interest of business and French and U.S. and British imperialist interests in the region. So we have to say no to U.S. arms.
Here's a photo of the protest in New York City. Now, video of the brave Israeli army arresting a 5-year-old Palestinian in Hebron because he threw a stone. We'd like to hear your comments about our program. Reach us at mail@thestruggle.org. That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller, and this is The Struggle.